This is part 2 of Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. In this section, he addresses the question of the origins of fairy stories, as well as the idea that fairy stories are meant particularly for children. I hope you are following along, and thank you for watching. What are the origins of fairy stories? I am too unlearned to deal with this question in any other way than with a few remarks that will hopefully suffice. It is plain enough that fairy stories, in wider or in narrower sense, are indeed very ancient. Related things appear in very early records, and they are found universally, wherever there is language. We are therefore obviously confronted with a variant of the problem that the archaeologist encounters, or the comparative philologist, with the debate between independent evolution, or rather invention, of the similar, inheritance from a common ancestry, and diffusion at various times from one or more centers. Most debates depend on an attempt by one or both sides at oversimplification, and I do not suppose that this debate is an exception. The history of fairy stories is probably more complex than the physical history of the human race, and as complex as the history of human language. All three things, independent invention, inheritance, and diffusion, have evidently played their part in producing the intricate web of story. It is now beyond all skill but that of the elves to unravel it. Of these three, invention is the most important and fundamental, and so, not surprisingly, also the most mysterious. To an inventor, that is, to a story maker, the other two must in the end lead back. Diffusion, borrowing in space, whether of an artifact or of a story, only refers the problem of origin elsewhere. At the center of the supposed diffusion, there is a place where once an inventor lived. Similarly with inheritance, borrowing in time, in this way we arrive at last only at an ancestral inventor. While if we believe that sometimes there occurred the independent striking out of similar ideas and themes or devices, we simply multiply the ancestral inventor, but do not, in that way, the more clearly understand his gift. Philology has been dethroned from the high place it once had in this court of inquiry. Max Muller's view of mythology as a, quote, disease of language can be abandoned without regret. Mythology is not a disease at all, though it may, like all human things, become diseased. You might as well say that thinking is a disease of the mind. It would be more near the truth to say that languages, especially modern European languages, are a disease of mythology. But language cannot, all the same, be dismissed. The incarnate mind, the tongue, and the tail are in our world coeval. The human mind, endowed with the powers of generalization and abstraction, sees not only green grass, discriminating it from other things, and finding it fair to look upon, but sees that it is green as well as being grass. But how powerful, how stimulating to the very faculty that produced it, was the invention of the adjective. No spell or incantation in fairy is more potent. And that is not surprising. Such incantations might indeed be said to be only another view of adjectives, a part of speech in a mythical grammar. The mind that thought of light, heavy, gray, yellow, still, swift, also conceived of magic that would make heavy things light and able to fly, turn gray lead into yellow gold, and the still rock into swift water. If it could do the one, it could do the other. It inevitably did both. When we can take green from grass, blue from heaven, and red from blood, we have already an enchanter's power upon one plane, and the desire to wield that power in the world external to our mind awakens. It does not follow that we shall use that power well upon any plane. We may put a deadly green upon a man's face and produce a horror. We may make the rare and terrible blue moon to shine. Or we may cause woods to spring with silver leaves and rams to wear fleeces of gold, and put hot fire into the belly of a cold worm. But in such fantasy, as it is called, new form is made. Fairy begins. Man becomes a sub-creator. An essential power of fairy is thus the power of making immediately effective by the will the visions of fantasy. Not all are beautiful, or even wholesome, not at any rate the fantasies of fallen man. And he has stained the elves who have this power, in verity or in fable, with his own stain. This aspect of mythology, subcreation, rather than either representation or symbolic interpretation of the beauties and terrors of the world, is, I think, too little considered. I will now turn to children, and so come to the last and most important of the three questions. What, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? It is usually assumed that children are the natural or the specially appropriate audience for fairy stories. In describing a fairy story which they think adults might possibly read for their own entertainment, reviewers frequently indulge in such waggeries as, quote, "This book is for children from ages of 6 to 60. But I have yet never seen the puff of a new motor model that began thus. This toy will amuse infants from 17 to 70, though that, to my mind, would be much more appropriate." Is there any essential connection between children's and fairy stories? Is there any call for comment if an adult reads them for himself? Reads them as tales, that is, not studies them as curios. Adults are allowed to collect and study anything, even old theater programs or paper bags. Among those who still have enough wisdom not to think fairy stories pernicious, the common opinion seems to be that there is a natural connection between the minds of children and fairy stories, of the same order as the connection between children's bodies and milk. I think this is an error, at best an error of false sentiment, and one that is therefore most often made by those who, for whatever private reason, such as childlessness, tend to think of children as a special kind of creature, almost a different race, rather than as normal, if immature, members of a particular family, and of the human family at large. Actually, the association of children and fairy stories is an accident of our domestic history. Fairy stories have, in the modern lettered world, become relegated to the nursery as shabby or old-fashioned furniture is relegated to the playroom, primarily because adults do not want it, and do not mind if it is misused. It is not the choice of the children which decides this. Children as a class, except in a common lack of experience they are not one, neither like fairy stories more, nor understand them better than adults do, and no more than they like many other things. They are young and growing and normally have keen appetites, so the fairy stories as a rule go down well enough. But in fact, only some children and some adults have a special taste for them. And when they have it, it is not exclusive, nor even necessarily dominant. It is a taste, though, that would not appear, I think, very early in childhood without artificial stimulus. It is certainly one that does not decrease, but increases with age, if it is innate. It is true that in recent times fairy stories have usually been written or adapted for children. But so may music be, or verse, or novels, or history, or scientific manuals. It is a dangerous process even when it is necessary. It is indeed only saved from disaster by the fact that the arts and sciences are not as a whole relegated to the nursery. The nursery and schoolroom are merely given such tastes and glimpses of the adult world as would seem fit for them in adult opinion, often much mistaken. Any one of these things would, if left altogether in the nursery, become gravely impaired. So would a beautiful table, a good picture, or a useful machine, such as a microscope, be defaced or broken if it were left long unregarded in a schoolroom. Fairy stories, banished in this way, cut off from a full adult art, would, in the end, be ruined. Indeed, in so far as they have been so banished, they have been ruined. The value of fairy stories is thus not, in my opinion, to be found by considering children in particular. Collections of fairy stories are, in fact, by nature attics and lumber rooms, only by temporary and local custom playrooms. Their contents are disordered and often battered, a jumble of different dates, purposes, and tastes, but among them may occasionally be found a thing of permanent virtue, an old work of art, not too much damaged that only stupidity would have ever stuffed away. I have said, perhaps, more than enough on this point. At least it will be plain that, in my opinion, fairy stories should not be specially associated with children. They are associated with them, naturally, because children are human, and fairy stories are a natural human taste, though not necessarily a universal one. Accidentally, because fairy stories are a large part of the literary lumber that in latter-day Europe has been stuffed away in attics. Unnaturally, because of erroneous sentiment about children, a sentiment that seems to increase with the decline in children. And that concludes part 2 of J.R.R. Tolkien's On Fairy Stories. Thank you for watching.